We're going to be covering part 2 of the glute layering model in this section. In the first section, we covered the aspects shown in our glute layering pyramid here. So addressing structural issues and how if that structure is not in an appropriate alignment, whether that is the foot, it's the hip, whatever it is, that your glutes are going to begin to be inhibited, or some muscle along the way will be inhibited, and that's going to create an inefficient hip extension firing pattern. RPR, reflexive performance reset, how we can utilize that to increase or improve the pattern that our athletes are experiencing, basically ensuring that those major movers of hip extension, so glute, hamstring, opposite QL, are occurring in that order. The glute isometrics, basically for corticomotor excitability, and then the different progressions from the time under tension that each athlete is capable of withstanding prior to compensating, and then from mid-range muscle belly force to the extremities, and then also from ground to standing as we begin to transfer that ability to utilize those glutes in all movements. Finally then, the last layer, the three-dimensional contralateral, which is hyperlinked in part 1, just is the idea of taking all of these aspects, firing in the appropriate pattern through hip extension, and utilizing it in all 3 planes of motion, basically trying to repeatedly fire that correct 1, 2, 3 pattern, glute, hamstring, opposite, QL, repeatedly, and to basically train that athlete to utilize that in different ranges of motion or movements. So glute dysfunction is not going to mean that you're paralyzed. Obviously, our bodies are always going to find a way, but there are many times that we find our best athletes are not functioning in the most efficient manner possible. So our goal through this is to create efficiency and also safety for our athletes. So those kind of go hand in hand, but when our athletes are functioning in that appropriate hip extension firing pattern, they're going to be utilizing their major muscles as their major muscles. So your body's always going to find a way to move, and our goal as performance coaches, practitioners, is to ensure that that athlete is completing those movements in the most efficient but also powerful manner possible, as that's going to aid in their performance and safety on the field. So this is a system of systems. Obviously, like each of these aspects of this layer, of this layered pyramid, are their own respective training programs or available options to improve performance of an athlete. But when we layer them in this manner, we're going to see some of the highest levels of return in changes, and we're going to show you some of those as we work through this part 2. So a quick example I like to use is home improvement. Our athletes, it's kind of the easiest way for them to understand it. But basically, you're thinking the 3 hip extension firing patterns are 3 different light switches, and only one of them is optimal. The other 2, maybe they're rewired inappropriately, but for whatever reason, eventually those 2 are going to lead to a system failure. So it might not be today, it might not be in 5 years, and maybe the athlete is fortunate enough that they're such a good compensator that they don't ever realize it, but eventually if the load is placed high enough, that if they're pressed hard enough, they're going to see a system failure from running the incorrect pattern. And the optimal light pattern is only available when all of those components, the structure, the RPR, the glute isos, and the 3D contralateral, and then also the transfer of training that we're going to get into, are covered appropriately. So how I explain this to my athletes is the structure is like the circuit breaker at your house. So you're still getting power to your house. There's a way to get power in, but if that circuit breaker is not functioning, all right, it's not going to be working efficiently, all right? So that circuit breaker is off from your structure. That body's in defense mode. It's not going to utilize that to the highest extent, that muscle. The RPR is improving the wiring, so it's increased efficiency and functioning. So we're taking that circuit breaker now that has been flipped on, and we showed you that in part 1, that athlete that shut down and then we addressed some structural issues, and glutes popped right back on the following day. So we're gonna, RPR is gonna be used after that structure to increase that efficiency in the functioning. The glute iso is upgrading whatever room, so in this case the glutes, to an energy efficient light bulb. So now your athlete is producing more light with less energy. But again, that if the circuit breaker is on or is not functioning and structure is off, then this won't work. Like that athlete can, if you're standing on the street and someone says, hey, flip a light on in your bedroom, but your structure is not functioning, then they're going to have to, because that light switch won't even work because there's no power to that room, they're going to have to flip a light on maybe in a hallway to get light to shine through that room to the person standing on the street. All right, so that's just a way our body's going to compensate to create a pattern that person on the street might say, hey, yeah, there's light in your room, but it's not coming from the desired room. And then finally, the 3D contralateral. So we want the appropriate light switch. So there's 3 light switch or 3 lights, and we're firing the appropriate one over and over and over again within that athlete's means of availability. So obviously if we work beyond that, what they're available at that time, because we haven't improved their wiring enough through RPR, or they haven't upgraded to the energy efficient light bulb, as long as we keep them from compensating into the other 2 light switches, they're going to be repeatedly use the appropriate one over and over and over again. And that is this firing pattern through hip extension that we've talked about, the glute, the hamstring, and the opposite QL. If they're using the other 2, so if they're driving from QL or driving from hamstring, eventually they're going to see a breakdown. And that's our goal as performance coaches, is to ensure that we're keeping our athletes on the field and as highly functional as possible. So transfer of training. Obviously, the pieces we've talked about up to this point have been very slow and controlled, and that could not be further from the case for our athletes on the field. So in every exercise that we're using in our weight room should be reinforcing this. So if we're creating hip extension, our athletes should feel their glutes fire first, then hamstring, then opposite QL, and as they transfer that force throughout the body, whether we are sprinting, squatting, whatever the exercise is, our goal should still be to have that sore butt that we talked about from those glute isos. We want to transfer that availability from our glute isos and as we progress to more gravity-based movements in the isometric piece, and then even into our actual training, we want to maintain that idea of our athletes should consistently be sore through their glutes. So we start in the warm-up. So we're using exercises for structure, and we're priming our glutes, just like we've talked about the layers, and we'll use RPR daily in our warm-up. So we're covering kind of our 3 base layers almost every day now with what we're seeing from our EMG results from our athletes that we're doing this with. And then high-level coaching is going to be required. Obviously, you need that coach's eye that we discussed in part 1 to see if that athlete is creating extension through their back, or are they stuck in a forward position where they're placing more stress on their hamstrings with every stride or exercise that they're completing. So this transfer of training piece is much more open-ended, and I'll hyperlink the presentation that I did most recently. And in that, the demo portion has all of these potential exercises that we use for transfer of training, but also from structure all the way up the pyramid. So you can see those and start to implement those. So tracking performance, this is Athos again and what we're seeing. So the blue line is one of our high performers. Like clearly if the glute is above 25% contribution, and this is including glute, hamstring, outside quad, and inside quad, then we're going to consider them to be a high performer. So this athlete in the blue consistently remains high, still working up between 30 and 35%. This athlete in the red, on the other hand, starts at a really high level and then slowly begins to drop. So this is something that when we have this available, this EMG, the opportunity to intervene becomes much more available to us as coaches, and we can say, hey, this athlete's no longer functioning in an appropriate manner. How can we get them back to what we're doing? So these 2 athletes completed identical programming. but they had different response. Obviously, the blue is ideal and the red is not. So the intervention that we took with this athlete, the athlete in the red, we did some movement testing. So first we decided to see, all right, what movements are they seeing glute function in? What are they not? And then we did a series of testing protocols within that, and to determine what gave us the most bang for our buck. And what we came out with is basically a lot of this work that we have here. So we have our hip structure work and RPR work that we completed, and then we implemented 8 minutes of glute isos. So I know we talked about 20 minutes in part one, but obviously we have to work with what's available as coaches. So if we only have 8 minutes, then that's what we're going to use. And what we saw is this top box up here is post-intervention. So we can see, so we're pulling that from right here. Right here. And as we implement this 8 minutes of glute isos, we're seeing a 3% increase per day. Now, we're also in finals right now. We're beginning to back off a little bit. We're in discretionary period, so this athlete hasn't been capable of coming in consistently and doing this, and we've seen this level out pretty quickly. So it's shown us the importance of doing this on a daily setting, and for that reason, we're starting to work it into, even if it's only 4 to 5 minutes per day, pre-practice, pre-training. Like, I will gladly take a set or a series of exercises off of my actual strength performance program and make sure that each of our athletes are receiving this, because it's going to keep them on the field and more effectively producing force than if we worry about if this red athlete were to continue to track downwards and we were more focused on doing a back squat or a step up or whatever exercise you want to select, because they're no longer functioning in an efficient manner. And that's what we're able to see through this EMG in a very rapid setting. So implementing this throughout the annual plan. GPP is our first off-season phase. That's where you're going to see us more energy system development, and we're going to do aerobic and glycolytic training. That's going to be the first 5 weeks. And our layered example, so structure, RPR, glute isometrics, and then the 3D contralateral is all going to fit into that. So our athletes get about 3 weeks of the 3D contralateral, and then we'll progress into more glycolytic at training aspects. But so you see they get a pretty high stimulus of that entire pyramid when we begin our off season. Our RPR, reflexive performance reset, is going to be addressed year round. And then during downloads, we're going to go back to our glute iso and 3D contralateral. Obviously, with the EMG shown before, it's going to be important to utilize that throughout the year, because otherwise you're going to see athletes start to drop off. That residual may not be there as long for some as others, and they just may not be as high functioning athletes as previously thought by the staff. Strength, power, and speed phases. Obviously, like we talked about, the utilization of transfer of training. Can you use exercises to drive this pattern? We can do this in eccentric, isometric positions, creating strength in certain spots, and then obviously increase the speed by decreasing the load, and that leads us right into our transfer of training down that force velocity curve, which is going to be most similar to what our athletes experience on the field. When we get to our in-season, we'll create an individualized warm-up. So this is what we were talking about, the addressing structure. And then even if it's 4 to 5 minutes of glute isos, like people kind of bash on the quote-unquote activation work through those glute isos and what are they doing. But the EMG that we demonstrated on the last slide has been proof enough for us that we're implementing that each day. Our athletes are coming in and pre-practice, ensuring that they are putting themselves in the best possible place to perform at a high level, while also utilizing major muscles as major muscles. Travel and postural reset, and I'll make sure these two are hyperlinked on here, but I'll make sure they get hyperlinked as well in this. We travel quite a bit, especially for a lacrosse team. We're in the Big East, traveling from Denver, so we make that trip pretty often. And as soon as we land, we're implementing this travel and postural reset to allow our athletes to make sure that we can achieve true hip extension. We've been stuck on a plane for 4 hours. or in class even before that, and then going right to the bus, right to the plane. And then other aspects are addressed in this as well. And then pregame implementation, warm-up. So we will utilize a lot of these aspects again, very similar to our individualized warm-up, to make sure that each of our athletes is functioning at the highest level. So again, overall goals of the glute layering model are to address incorrect compensation patterns. So create that state of explosion in hip extension, glute to hamstring to opposite QL. And that's going to lead to major muscles being major muscles, which is going to maximize movement efficiency in our athletes. Again, looking at force plate data paired with that EMG that we have. How active are the muscles while they're producing force? And then if we change their pattern to more efficient, does that increase their force while decreasing their true muscle output measured through that EMG? These are just all aspects to consider in creating that efficiency. So that's going to reduce the injury likelihood, both soft tissue and catastrophic. And then obviously throughout the annual plan, you want to make sure that you're transferring these patterns. So like the 3D contralateral is great for volume, and all of these other layers here are great for basic introduction of these principles. But then it's important that as a coach, you're continuing to utilize this hip extension firing pattern throughout training to make sure that your athletes have it available for them on the field.